Hi kids, I'm going to talk to you about these notes called Sound Effects in Literature, Part 1, Alliteration and Cacophony. While I'm looking at it here, I'm realizing that I want it to be in Times New Roman, because that's the font you have to use in your essay, and I want to set a good example. Before I talk about this top part, I'm going to jump down to the second page and show you this poem, and you'll see it on the second page in your own notes. I want you to read this poem to yourself, and I'm going to read it to you. It's by Robert Frost. You see, I like to use his poems partly because they're easy to understand. It's not hard to tell what he's talking about, and partly because they are full of the qualities that make literature literature. All right, so here's this simple poem, Nothing Gold Can Stay. To spoil it ahead of time and save us some work, I'll tell you that in this poem, he's saying that perfect things are temporary. It's a little bit of like a bummer take on life, but there you have it. So he's using the idea of things being gold, quote unquote, to represent things being perfect. So nothing gold can stay basically means perfect things don't last. All right, nature's first grain is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf. So Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day. Nothing gold can stay. So I could talk I could talk for an hour about this poem because he's doing a lot of clever things here. But what I want to talk to you about today is what you may notice with your ear or with your eyes because I've highlighted it, this use of repeated sound. Look at the second line where he says, her hardest hue to hold. Hopefully you remember from word choice that authors think extremely carefully about the words they choose to put in their excellent writing. They don't just write down the first words that come into their head. So it's not the case that he started to write this poem and her hardest hue to hold was just the first thing that popped into his head. And it was a coincidence that these words all have the sound. That's not the case. It was on purpose. He could have said so hue means like color, but there are other synonyms, shade, tone, tint, right? He could have said her toughest tint to hold and had a totally different sound being repeated. Down here, he didn't have to say, so dawn goes down to day. He could have, within the rhythm he's trying to create, he could have expressed that same idea that you have dawn and then really quickly it goes away and then you just have regular old boring day. He could have expressed that idea using a lot of different words, but he specifically chose these words that have create this duh, duh, duh effect. So what is this? Well, this is alliteration. I'm going to talk in a little bit about cacophony, but this is alliteration. So let's go back to the top here. Hopefully you remember from the beginning of the quarter and from me mentioning it other times that when we call something literature, we're saying that because it's original, because it's emotionally moving, because it's carefully crafted, and or because it is deep. I put emotionally moving in bold because that's the quality of a piece of writing that's affected by the author using repeated sound. So one way that literature can be emotionally moving is in the sounds of the words themselves, the sounds. And the reason that that's a thing is that sounds have inherent emotional qualities or meanings. Inherent means already existing inside of them. You might be saying to yourself, well, how could a sound have a meaning in it if it's not part of a word? And there are different theories for why sounds do have meanings in them. But to demonstrate to you that it's true, I want you to imagine that you're holding like a newborn baby in your arms, like a little cousin or sister or brother or something. Would you ever in 1,000 years hold that little baby and look in its face so tenderly and then make this sound? Like, would you ever do that in a baby's face? No, right? That would be crazy. Now, why though? Like, why do you know that that's crazy? You have an instinct inside you that tells you that this little baby creature that can't speak any English and doesn't understand any words would automatically find that sound upsetting. And you're correct, right? There are other sounds you would never make at a newborn baby because your gut tells you this would be an upsetting sound. Like you would never say to a baby, right? But and then there are other sounds that you might sort of spontaneously make to a baby because you know they would be soothing or delightful. Like you might say, ba 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 ba. You know that would make a baby, happy. Or you might say, right? Or shh. Your gut tells you the feeling that's inside these sounds. Nobody had to teach that to you. And a baby will react to those sounds just how you expect because there are meanings that exist inside those sounds, even when we haven't learned the language that uses those sounds. All right, so alliteration. A lot of you know this word. Alliteration is repeated sound in a piece of writing. Now, common misconception, it doesn't have to be at the beginning of the word, it can be anywhere. So when you have a repeated sound in a piece of writing, that's alliteration. It's not a repeated letter, because think about it for a minute. S and C can both make a S sound, right? And K and C can both make a K sound. So you could have a C used 2 or 3 times in one short line, but it's not necessarily making the same sound every time. So alliteration is repeated sound. There are some sounds that are made of more than one letter, like ch, right? So if you have multiple ch, ch, ch in a line, that's alliteration, even though it's more than one letter. Repeated sound. Now, there are 2 subtypes that you should know. One is consonants. That's when you have a repeated consonant sound. We spell that C-O-N-S-O-N-A-N-C-E. Consonant sounds are sounds that sound like they would be written using consonants, like k k k b b b d d d ch 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 r right? Then there's a word for repeated vowel sound. This is if you're reading and you repeatedly hear in the words ah ah or ooh ooh or I or over and over. And the word for that is assonance. ASSONANCE. Since this is called consonants, you would think that this would be called vowelants, but instead we get assonance, a word that makes 6th graders everywhere giggle. Now, how do we know sound is being repeated? The truth is, it's repeated if it stands out to the ear, but actually, a lot of times repeated sound doesn't stand out to a 6th grade ear because you're not in the habit of noticing it. So I made up a rule for you to use in your own poem, which is I'm going to say you can count it as repeated if it occurs 2 or more times in the space of 6 syllables. So if you're not sure, is this sound repeated in my poem? Then use this rule. Really, but as I said, the standard really is, does it stand out to your ear? Now, when a writer repeats a sound, like when Robert Frost says, so dawn goes down today, or when he says, her hardest hue to hold, when he does that, what he wants is he wants you to add the feeling that goes with that sound or the meaning of that sound to the meaning that you are putting on the piece of writing. So looking at this poem again, nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. What he means by this is that the first color that you see outdoors in the springtime isn't green, even though we think of green as being the color of like things coming back to life. He's saying it's nature's first green is gold. He's kind of like playing with your understanding of color a little bit because you're like, no, green isn't gold. But he's saying it's gold in the sense of it being like perfect. And when he says her hardest hue to hold, what he means is this is the most difficult color for nature to hold on to. This is the color that goes away the quickest, the very, very, very first green. I don't know how much attention you pay to like bushes or trees or flowers, but when they first bloom in the springtime, you get a really, really delicate green. And then it becomes a richer green, and any flowers that initially bloomed usually fall off pretty quickly. Like late in the summer, you don't have a ton of flowers. The time you have flowers is in spring, and then the flowers fall off, and then you just have like the deep, rich green color. But the initial color he's talking about here is this beautiful pale green that is perfect. and it's the color that goes away the quickest. Nature's hardest hue to hold. Okay, so why is he saying ha, 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 though? Because, like, what is that sound? It's the sound of breath. It's the sound of wind, right? It's the sound of air. And air is kind of like the definition of something you can't hold. It's almost like a cliche, this idea that you can't hold on to the wind, right? Or you can't see it, you can't touch it, it's invisible, can't grab it. So he's invoking this idea of breath or wind to help emphasize his message here, which is this color comes and goes so quickly. It's a color no one can hold on to. It comes in and out of our lives like the wind. Then later, when he's essentially saying, oh, the sun comes up in the morning, it's so beautiful, but then it's over really quickly, and then we have a regular old boring day, which isn't nearly as pretty, which is what he's saying here. When he says that, he says it with a repeated d, d, d sound, which, if you think about it, is like a kind of unpleasant, heavy, sad sound. Like if your friend is being dumb and missing something that's really obvious, you will literally say to your friend, duh, right? There's a reason that sound works for that meaning. It just wouldn't have the same impact for you to say to your friend, zoo, it doesn't feel the same. But duh just sounds dull, right? And kind of stupid. And he's trying to bring in that dull, gray, sad feeling in this line by repeating duh, duh, duh. Sometimes writers will create sounds in the writing that are literally the sound effect of what they're describing. So these are two lines from a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson called "The Princess, Come Down, O Maid." He's describing a beautiful area, and he's talking about the sound that doves are making in ancient elm trees and the sound of countless bees. And the words he used to describe those two things are the moan of doves in immemorial elms and murmuring of innumerable bees. Now read that out loud to yourself, but while you do it, put your fingers on the bridge of your nose, on the part of your nose that's like the bone, and feel what happens in there when you read it out loud. Do you feel your bone in your face like vibrating? He's literally making a buzzing sound in your head by using this repeated mm, mm, mm. So the bees that he's talking about here, he's bringing to life in your head on purpose with his use of sound. He's making your head buzz as you read it. Because the expectation these writers have is that we're going to read their writing out loud, actually. I could talk for a whole another hour about like how poetry in its original uh, incarnation is something that's spoken, not written. But okay. Now, here is a chart I made for you to use. It's a chart that has a bunch of like sounds and the emotion or meaning that usually goes with it. I made this chart because a lot of kids feel like, I'm not really sure what it feels like when I hear ka. If you're not sure, use this chart. But the truth is, and I highlighted this here, this is just sort of the feelings that tend to go with these sounds. You should trust your own ear. And chances are you might not need this. Like, do you really need me to tell you that b sounds like fun and playful and silly? Probably not. I have one column here for consonant sounds. I have another column here for vowel sounds. I didn't put every possible repeated vowel sound. But up here, this is the general rule. Long vowels like I tend to sound more sharp and aggressive, and repeated short vowel sounds like and tend to sound more hesitant and more light and relaxed. If you want to open a new tab and go on YouTube and search up Crazy Train and listen to the first like 30 seconds of that song, ask yourself, how did Ozzy Osbourne know that if he wanted to sound insane, he should say I. How did he know? He didn't have an English teacher to tell him. His gut just told him that that would be a sharp, intense, high energy, annoying sound. Imagine him singing that song, but beginning instead of like I. Imagine him beginning with like It wouldn't have the same effect, right? It doesn't work because this sounds aggressive. I. This sounds like low energy, depressed, possibly peaceful, depending on the context. All right, now cacophony. Cacophony is related to alliteration, but not identical. Cacophony. I believe, so P-H-O-N, that's sound, right? And the caco, I believe, means ugly. This is Greek. You could Google it and find out. Cacophony is what's happening in writing when you have unpleasant or jarring, meaning they move you but in a bad way, unpleasant or jarring sound combinations. And cacophony makes us feel uncomfortable or unpleasant. The adjective form is cacophonous, and basically, if it's difficult to get out of your mouth, your ear tends to hate it. So some alliteration is cacophonous, but you can also have cacophony without alliteration. And I'll show you examples. So here's a poem called Blackberry Eating about a guy who is eating frozen blackberries. And in the poem, he talks both about how much he loves to do it, but also describes it in such a way where you could tell it's kind of awful at the same time. I mean, just imagine biting into a frozen blackberry, right? So I color-coded the different sound repetition you have. In the beginning, you have a lot of buh, which creates this like fun, cheerful sound. I love to go out in late September among fat, overripe, icy blackberries to eat blackberries for breakfast. So he's got in your ear this buh. But then at the same time, he's overlapping it with this repeated blackberries for breakfast, the stalks very prickly. So repeated to the ear makes us uncomfortable. He's overlapping these two feelings, this feeling of like, oh, I'm amused, but oh, I kind of don't like it either. Then what I put in bold here is, so here we've got cacophony, that's alliteration. So repeated sound that's ugly to the ear. Stalks very prickly. But you could also have cacophony without alliteration. And what's weird and kind of meta about this poem is the poem actually talks about cacophony without using that word. He compares blackberries to certain peculiar words like strength or squinched, many-lettered, one-syllabled lumps. So strength and squinched are words that are like automatically cacophony. Like think about that word, squinched. Hear that in your ear. It's difficult to get out of your mouth, and your ear doesn't like hearing all those different consonant sounds crammed together. Squinched. Ugh. It's cacophonous. This is an example of cacophony without repeated sound. There's no repeated sound in this word, but the word is just ugly to the ear because all the sounds are jammed together. So you can have ugly sound by repeating certain sounds that are just ugly, like you can have ugly sound by cramming together a bunch of sounds that just don't sound pretty when you put them together. If you scroll down, you'll see one more example of cacophony. This is an excerpt from a poem by Sylvia Plath. In this poem, the poem takes place in a cave. She's like a miner, she says, I believe, in the first stanza. Waxy stalactites. Ugh. You know, stalactites are those things that grow from the top of a cave, or cave roof, right? Waxy stalactites. That's so unpleasant to the ear. Later on in the poem, old cave of calcium icicles, old echoer. Old cave of calcium icicles, old echoer. It's just unpleasant. Like you wouldn't have to speak English to be disturbed by that sound combination. You got the O and the k and the s all crammed together. It's not lovely. There is repeated sound here and there is cacophony. So when you do a row for alliteration, what you're going to do, or cacophony, you're going to find in your poem, and many of you will find it because most but not all poems tend to feature it, either a moment where the writer's obviously repeating a sound, or a moment where the writer is deliberately making ugly sounds. And if you ask yourself, why has Ms. Arnschimmel been asking us to read our poems out loud over and over? This is the point where that becomes useful to you. So hopefully you'll find either a moment of repeated sound or of ugly sound. The ugly sound can be repeated. You just have to find one, even if your poem features a ton of it. And so for your evidence, you would quote the line or lines that have it. So let's say if this was my evidence, I could put quote marks, / right? And then lines, I'm just going to guess here, like 21 to 22. And also probably a good idea in the evidence box just to remind yourself, either write the word cacophony, or you could write repeated O sound. Let's say you want to talk about that one. And then in your feeling column, you're going to write what you normally write, which is either this cacophony makes the reader feel, or this alliteration makes the reader feel. Or you could do think about. And possibly you'll have the answer just from asking your gut, how does this sound make me feel? If it doesn't come to you right away, go look at this chart. So if you notice, for example, that Sylvia Plath has got a repeated sound, oh, Ms. Arnschimmel says that creates a hard and aggressive and cold feeling. Oh yeah, that kind of does, like I see that. That could be your feeling sentence. But again, it could also just come from your gut. All right, so while you're doing your alliteration and cacophony row, come and ask me if you have any questions. That's it.